Lost and Found. Wherever Adolf Hitler drove in his motorcade, the crowds turned out to cheer. A car ride in a triumphant parade was his favorite form of public relations. But he was worried about assassins. So he had an armored limousine built for himself. This limousine carried Hitler through most of World War II. And then, in a bizarre twist of fate, the car switched sides. It would take almost 40 years and a mountain of research to link it back to the Führer. Hitler loved cars. He rarely missed a chance to go to an auto show or a car race. He also never missed a chance to be seen, admired, and photographed while cruising along in one of his many giant Daimler-Benz limousines. Hitler understood what the cars did for his image.
I think the mystique of the Nazi regime, the special emphasis they put on their public relations and their huge rallies and things like that, which these cars were part of, and Hitler's position certainly gave the cars a great prominence and a central part in the sort of the Nazi propaganda machinery.
But Hitler had plenty of enemies. So in early November 1939, Hitler's personal chauffeur ordered a new armored parade car. It was a Grosse Mercedes 770, built to accommodate a standing passenger. The front right-hand seat folded up to reveal a platform about 5 inches high. There was a grip at the top of the windshield to allow the standing rider to steady himself. What was new about this limo was the extensive security features. Half-inch thick steel armor plating lined the floorboards, and with the already heavy exterior, the total weight was more than 9,000 pounds. A leather-covered metal shield could be cranked up behind the rear seat. And the bulletproof window glass was 1¼ inches thick. Ironically, even though Hitler was afraid of assassins, it was still a parade car. So it was a convertible. 8 months after the order, on July 8, 1940, the new Mercedes was delivered to Hitler's personal car pool in Berlin. And just 10 days after delivery, the Führer was seen riding in it. Its service to the Third Reich had begun.
It would seem to have been one of his more popular Mercedes vehicles. And so this was probably the thing he would bring out for the really special occasions, the big events, where he really wanted to make an impact.
September 10, 1941, Marienburg, East Prussia. November 1941, at a state funeral. March 15, 1942, at the Zughaus to give an address on Germany's Heroes Memorial Day. In 1943, according to Daimler-Benz records, the car came in for repairs and was returned to Hitler's carpool on September 15th of that year.
And that is the last documentary photographic reference or whatever to the car at all until May 1945 when it was captured by the Americans.
Just days before the German surrender in May 1945, U.S. Army Sergeant Joe Azzara of the 20th Armored Division spotted a glitzy limo strapped to a rail car parked south of Salzburg, Austria. As Azzara later explained, he and some buddies had to fight off German snipers, and then they approached the car.
I'm sure it would not be a major problem for them to get this thing off the railway flatbed. They were an armored division. They were used to moving heavy vehicles.
Once he got it down and running, Sergeant Azzara asked the locals about the origins of the car. As the story goes, a local mechanic said that it had been shipped there, quote, because it was out of gas, and even Goering could get no more, end quote. From that day forward, the car was misidentified as belonging to Reich Marshal Hermann Goering. But despite the inaccuracy, Goering was of high enough rank to make the car a highly prized trophy of war. A day or so after the car was liberated, the war in Europe came to an end. But even though Azzara had risked his neck to get the car, it wasn't his to keep. The vehicle that had once carried America's greatest enemy was now drafted for duty by the other side. With a bright Allies star painted on its side, the limo went into carpool service for 2 American generals. When the 20th Armored Division left Europe, the car came home with it. The Boston Daily Globe heralded its arrival with the headline, "Goering's Auto Bulletproof to Protect Fat Marshall's Hide." The 4-wheeled POW was overhauled and put right to work. The car went on tour for the 8th Victory Bond drive.
The Mercedes was so much identified with Germany and its automotive industry, and they had been so much a part of the Nazi mystique that, yes, that this was sort of paraded around.
Eventually, the car was put into storage at the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where it languished for 10 years. Then, in 1956, the government decided to clean house and auctioned the limo off for $2,700 to a Canadian collector. In 1969, the car changed hands again. The newest owner offered it to the Canadian War Museum in exchange for a tax deduction. The museum took the deal.
The caption that was put up on it said it was Goering's car. There was some tendency within the War Museum to dissociate it from Goering. And they were not convinced by the evidence.
That's when a librarian at the museum named Ludwig Koch became curious about the car. Koch found the factory vehicle number stamped on the firewall, the metal shield between the engine and the driver. By tracing that number back through the Daimler-Benz archives, Koch was able to document that the car was delivered to Hitler's own carpool. But that wasn't solid enough evidence that Hitler himself had used the car. The real evidence finally surfaced, literally, when the many years of paint were stripped off the car's original license plates. Koch found photos of Hitler in a car bearing the same license plate number. Still, because of all the restoration work, it was hard to make a real match from the photos. So, Koch got out a microscope.
He looked closer at the photographs, and there are a lot of features that this car has that other cars have, but all these features together seem to refer only to this car.
The lights on the front had changed, but 4 vents under the windshield, silver cooling hoses for the supercharged engine, and short curved rear windows could not be found on any other vehicle of the Third Reich. Now Koch was sure. In 1982, at long last, the car was identified beyond a reasonable doubt as one of Hitler's own. The museum changed its display to reflect that.
Pretty soon the complaints started to come in that this is a bit too much. This is almost a Nazi shrine.
Does the vehicle's presence in the museum glorify Hitler? Or is it a worthwhile exhibit on the lessons of the Nazi era? The controversy has continued since the car was correctly relinked to Hitler. The exhibit has even been challenged on the ground that it should not be in the Canadian War Museum at all, since there is no direct Canadian connection to the limousine.
And so it does create sort of some problems from us from a point of view of a museum. Undoubtedly popular. Our Hitler car, that's what seems to seize people's imagination perhaps a bit more than we would like it to.
Hitler's staff and parade car is currently on public display at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada.